Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Antony.
And this is Words and Numbers.
Brought to you by the good people at CACI, the Center for American Culture and Ideas. Ant, what's new and exciting in your world this week?
Well, I've got two things that I want to talk about. One is Argentina's president, who we should probably do a whole episode on, Javier Milei. He's been doing a bunch of free market stuff down there. And the one that caught my eye just recently is he's pushing legislation. I was going to read it to you, except the site that I was reading from was in English a moment ago, and now it's in Spanish. Spanish. It was Portuguese. What do they speak in Argentina? Brazil is Portuguese. You don't even know.
I'm just sitting here waiting.
All right. He's pushing a law that is going to outlaw the use of the word free in reference to government benefits if the benefits are being paid for by taxpayers.
Well, that seems to fly in the face of your belief in free speech, Ant.
Well, that's a whole other issue I'm going to get to, but I think this is wonderful. It's one of the things that I've long complained about in this country when politicians say, well, just elect me and I'll give you this stuff for free. And it's never for free. It's always at taxpayer expense. So the real thing an honest politician would do is say, elect me and I'll give you this thing over here in exchange for you having less of this other thing over there. And he's looking to encode this in law. And that brings me to the question you raised. In the United States, does that fly in the face of free speech? And what occurs to me is we already have a restriction on free speech when it comes to commerce, the truth in advertising laws. So if I'm a company, I'm selling this thing, I cannot say that, buy this thing is going to help you live 10 years longer if indeed that's not true. So we already restrict free speech when it comes to commerce. Now, someone might say, yeah, but where politicians are concerned, there is no commerce, and there may not be in terms of dollars changing hands, but where economics is concerned, dollars changing hands is simply one way to enact commerce. Commerce is, I give you something, you give me something else in exchange. It doesn't have to be dollars on either side of that equation. And so what's the politician doing? The politician's saying, you give me something I want, which is your vote, your support, and I'll give you something, which is this thing I'm claiming is free. It violates this truth in advertising.
Well, yeah, maybe, but that's not the argument you made when we talked about free speech. What was it, last week, the week before? When you said speech should just be free, everybody should be able to say whatever they want, and the market will sort it out. You said something like that, didn't you?
Sure. But
so you're not saying that now?
No, what I'm saying is, practically speaking, we already have laws in place that restrict speech when it comes to commerce. And my question is, how is the politician running for office any different? Why don't these restrictions apply to him when he says, elect me and I'll give you stuff for free?
Well, you asked two separate questions there. You ask about politicians on the one hand and candidates on the other. And different rules are going to apply for a reason you might not know. But then again, you might. The candidate, I've got nothing to say about. That's going to be a bigger question for another day. The government functionary, and here I'm going to talk only about people in the House and in the Senate, their speech in those chambers is protected. They can say anything they want in there.
In the chambers.
And never be held accountable.
Okay, that's fine. I can live with that, but typically where politicians are saying this sort of thing is on the campaign trail.
Typically, yes. Well, that's typically where people hear it.
Sure.
They often say these things. For the nerds among you who want to know what I'm talking about, it's the speech and or debate clause, Article 1, Section 6, Clause 1 of our lovely Constitution. So you can go look it up there. We don't have to bother with it now. I don't know. This is a touchy one. And when it comes to Milei, we get a lot of email. I would say I get 10 times as much email about Milei right now as I do about any other topic, or maybe every other topic combined. And I always answer when I answer in the same way. We'll get to him on the podcast when there are some results we can talk about. for good or for ill. Right now, he's just another foreign politician where I stand. I don't have much to say about foreign politicians. I never do until there's something we can literally analyze and talk about. And at this moment, I don't think we've got that yet.
Before we move on, Millet was one of two things I wanted to talk about. The other one is news that came out this week, a good jobs report, and everybody was pointing to this saying, the economy is not in recession. We don't have to worry about that because we're creating more jobs. The headline was U.S. payrolls increased by over 200,000 in December, better than expected. I want to put this in context because I don't think we're headed to recession, but the news is not nearly as good as what you might think. First, the job gains that we have had have been largely in the public sector. The number of workers employed by governments, that's all levels, state, local, federal, increased 2.8%, almost 3% on an annualized basis, November to December, versus half of that, 1.5% for private sector workers. So much of the gains that we're seeing are being weighed in the public sector. Second, and this is where the numbers get interesting, although the unemployment rate remained unchanged, the number of employed people dropped by 700,000. The employment rate remained unchanged, but the number of employed people dropped by 700,000.
You're going to need to unpack that one, aren't you?
Yeah, and what's going on here is that most people think there are two categories here. A worker can be employed or unemployed, and there's actually three. The worker can be employed, unemployed, or non-employed. And to be non-employed means that you've dropped out of the labor force, possibly because you retired, possibly because you went back to school, possibly because you decide you're going to be a full-time homemaker, or possibly because you have been unemployed for so long you've given up looking for work. And what's happened here is when we measure the unemployment rate, we're measuring the number of unemployed people as a fraction of those who are either employed or those who are looking for work. If you've dropped out of the labor force, you don't appear in either one of those categories. So it's entirely possible that you can lose, as we did in December, lose 700,000 jobs, and yet your unemployment rate remains the same. If those 700,000 were people who went from the labor force to become now part of the non-employed.
Part of the success of Bidenomics is that people have given up looking for work.
Yeah. People have been unemployed for enough time, they've given up looking for work. This is a phenomenon that we saw during the housing crisis in 2008. There were people who were unemployed for so long that we stopped counting them. They now became non-employed, and you would see the unemployment rate dropping month after month after month. And yet when you ask people, they say, no, we're in the midst of a recession here. Things are not getting better. And the reason the unemployment rate was dropping is because we stopped counting these unemployed people. So that's part of what's going on with this latest jobs report. There's another thing going on. Over the past almost year, 11 job reports over the course of about 11 months, 10 of them have been revised downward. Now, here's what happens. When a job report comes out like it did last week, it's an estimate based on preliminary figures that have come in. It takes a while to collect these numbers. And so you get this preliminary estimate, and that's what all the headline stuff is. And then about a month later, you get more data coming in. You get a revised estimate. And then a couple months later, there's a third revision still as more data comes in. And what's happened is, of the past 11 job reports over the past 11 months, 10 of them, in the subsequent month, we came back and looked at more data and said, no, the numbers weren't nearly as good as what we reported last month. So if that's the case this time, we may well find that unemployment actually went up, depending on what numbers come out.
Well, interesting times ahead.
Yeah, and again, I don't think that we're headed for recession, but I do think the economy is going to be tepid for 2024. It's not going to be anything to write home about, but it's not going to be horrible either.
For the entire year, you think?
I think until about the third quarter.
And then what?
and then things will start to pick up. And that's with a huge footnote, assuming the government doesn't do something stupid.
So in the third quarter, nothing good will happen because government is always going to do something stupid. What the wrong with you? Assuming government does not. In an election year, no less, expect stupidity.
Right.
Anyway, given that you droned on for so long, I'll just head right to the foolishness of the week. Any idea who might
Is that
win
because you don't have a quick hit, James?
No, I do. It's just that you took 11 and a half minutes to get through what should have taken 2.
That's all right. People want to hear me more than you anyway.
No, that is incorrect. You jack.
What is your foolishness, James?
Well, do you have any idea who it might be?
Oh, no, I have no idea. I'm still unpacking boxes. I only saw the job reports number because it's now my job to look at these things.
Well, at least you have a job. Anyway, the second question in the quiz is, do you know who the defense secretary in these United States is?
I know this foolishness.
But do you know the guy's name?
I don't know his name, but I know the news.
Almost nobody does, so I'm not going to hold you all that responsible here. But his name is Lloyd Austin. And Lloyd had some complications from an elective surgery in the past week and a half or so, and went into the hospital, as you do. And they shifted him to intensive care, where he stayed and stayed and stayed. And he was there for 3 days before the President of the United States had any idea that it had happened.
Oh, my. Yeah.
Okay, if you want to know if your government is working, right, if it's functional, you can ask questions like, okay, what's the jobs report? And, look, you and I think, are on the same page. That's not typically indicative of whether your government's working or not. That's just a jobs report. What's inflation look like? Well, presidents don't have much to do with that sort of thing. They can nibble away around the margins and make a difference, but that's not how you tell if your government is working. How do you tell if your government is working? How long did it take the President of the United States to find out that his defense secretary was in intensive care?
And this is defense secretary. We're not talking about the Secretary of Education here. We're talking about the defense secretary in the midst of all the crisis going on in the Middle East.
And, not for nothing, but were I president, and I'm going to say that maybe I should be, given how things are going, but were I president, I would probably want to have a daily 15-minute conversation with my defense secretary to know what the is going on in the world, where that leaves us relative to everyone else, what we should do next, these sorts of trifling questions that you might ask. And yet, our president had no idea that our defense secretary was teetering near death in a hospital. Now, if that's not the foolishness of the mother year, I don't know what is. And we're only in January. One week in, and we already have a winner.
For one-stop shopping for all things James and Ant, visit our website, wordsandnumbers.org. We give a special shout-out to our Patreon sponsors who help us keep the lights on. If you'd like to contribute, go to patreon.com/wordsandnumbers.
We're talking about this group of people who are, I think, gaining ascendancy, and they're gaining especially in Europe, but you're going to see this nonsense percolate here in the United States pretty soon as well. And it's this thing called degrowth economics.
What do they mean by degrowth? I looked at this, and near as I can tell, it's young people spending less money.
Well, it's more, do you want to say it's more than that, or it's less than that? Degrowth economics, they are looking actively for a new word, because that one's not really a good PR move, right?
It doesn't trip off the tongue.
Yeah, degrowth is not something that the average middle-class household is going to want to think about, right, especially after they've lost $4,000, $6,000 of purchasing power in the last year. But degrowth economics is this belief, I think it's probably stranded at the level of belief, that, well, here, let me read to you from an article in Foreign Policy. We'll put the link in the show notes. With its deepest roots in direct democracy and anti-capitalism, the degrowth movement is bent on challenging the central tenet of post-war economics, that further increases in GDP, strongly correlated with increases in carbon emissions, translate to further advances in social and individual well-being. So they're trying to reduce GDP because reducing GDP will reduce carbon emissions.
Look, this is something that we and others have said going back 5 years or more, that at the root of the environmental movement is this desire to turn us back to the Middle Ages. They want to erase modern economies.
I don't think the Middle Ages, but I do think maybe the 18th century.
Yeah, it's this sense that everything the economy does is bad for the environment. And you can see this because of the solutions to environmental problems that they ignore. For example, nuclear energy.
No, that's exactly right. If you want to address carbon emissions, get working on nuclear.
Yeah, see, the problem is nuclear energy doesn't roll back GDP. That's what they want.
That's right. And here, let me read the next short paragraph as well, because I think it'll really set the stage for you. The implications of the critique extend far beyond the usual calls for countries to reach net zero emissions targets. To degrowthers, the climate crisis is a social problem, and addressing it will require no less than re-engineering the entire global socioeconomic order, especially in the wealthy global north.
How does this square with direct democracy that they claim?
It does not.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, and you and I know this just as a matter of course. Other people, I think, may need a refresher. The, quote, entire global socioeconomic order is an emergent order.
Yes.
It's not something that was created by a mind. It's something that just emerged from man's social condition. You can't re-engineer it because it only is what it is.
Yeah, it emerges naturally.
You can regulate it around the margins and almost always with devastating consequences. But you can't just simply sit there armchair style and decide what a globe is going to do.
Yeah.
It doesn't work that way because no matter what you decide, people will decide something else and then they're going to go do that. And then the game of whack-a-mole is on.
As I'm reading these articles, it's reminding me of the early days of the communist movement in Europe, where these armchair theorists had all these wonderful ideas about how they're going to re-engineer society and everything's going to be great. And what happens? They actually got the ability to gain power and put their ideas into practice. And the very first thing that happened is that people who seek power co-opted them to their own ends.
Yeah, funny how that happened. And look, let's be honest, right? We've got a condition, and these people, I think, are looking at a fundamental injustice. And I think it is a fundamental injustice that is going to have to be addressed in some way, shape, or form. And their constraint is the environment. All right, so anything they do to address any injustice has to first satisfy what they perceive as the needs of the environment. So what's the injustice? The injustice is that the rich West and the rich North, however you want to chunk out the world, polluted their way to prosperity. And look, that happened. It makes no sense to deny that that happened. So now rich environmentalists in the West and the North have a problem. What do they do when they look to the East and the South? Do they say, okay, go ahead and pollute your way to prosperity? Or do they say, sorry, you have to remain poor? They're not willing to say either of those things. But wait a minute. They are willing to say that second thing if and only if they can make the North and the West poor. So if we get poorer, then they're justified in telling the Indians and the Chinese, for example, you have to stop polluting now.
I see. Right. Right.
It's the only way they can reclaim the moral high ground.
And yet, it's our wealth that has enabled us to stop polluting.
Well, not only to stop polluting, but to actually roll back the ill effects
Right,
of the
yes.
pollution that we engaged in.
Yeah.
And that does happen, I think, remarkably so in the West. You look at things like reforestation, air quality, water quality, all very high in the rich Western world. So there is something that happens after you achieve prosperity that allows you to then reorient your goals to achieve a certain kind of cleanliness that you couldn't before.
Right.
Now, how long is that going to take in China and in India, among all the other places? I don't know. But these people say things like, well, the earth will become unlivable by 2070. And it's always this sky is falling nonsense that they trot out. And, you know, those of us who are old enough remember that we've already lived through a couple of their drop dead dates.
Right. That's right.
Right, that the world will be unlivable by. Well, we've already lived through a couple, and things are better, not worse. And when you look at what markets actually deliver, somehow or another, these beautiful outcomes always seem to occur.
Well, I think the beautiful outcomes occur because people want them to occur. You know, to the extent that you're able to have a roof over your head and feed your children and they're clothed and all of that, where does your attention turn next? Okay, let's live a better quality life. Let's, clean up the place. You can't turn your attention to that if your major concern is where do I get my next meal?
But it doesn't even stop there, right? It probably doesn't even start there. When you look at things like gender equality, where do you get it? You get it in rich market-based economies. When you look at child labor, where do you find the least of it? Rich market-based economies. So there is a certain kind of good life, and we've been talking about the good life a lot these last few weeks for one reason or another. And, look, I remember when I lived in Iraq, you know what nobody had there? A dog.
Why?
They're expensive.
Because they're expensive, sure. Of course. See, and living in a rich Western nation, that thought doesn't even occur to me. Of course.
No, of course I have a dog. Why would I live without a dog?
Yeah.
I love my dog, right? And that's just it. And we got a lot of pushback on a recent episode when I said pets are luxury items. People came after me. I got all kinds of email about it saying, well, I love my pets. Well, no kidding. I love mine too. That doesn't mean it's not a luxury item. Yep. If you lived in a poor country and you were poor, you wouldn't have pets. You might not have children either. Mm-hmm. Right? There are all kinds of things you're not going to have. Air conditioning comes to mind immediately as well. Electricity, water, all the things. And yet here we have all those things and they're pretty clean. And I've been digging into environmentalism a bit lately, and it seems that we've actually done quite a remarkable job in the United States at reducing carbon emissions.
Oh, we've done tremendous work. I mean, so much so that you could zero out the entire U.S. carbon emission at this point and not make a dent in world carbon emissions.
That seems to be the conclusion that I'm getting as I read into it more. And look, we can debate whether we've gone too far, whether it's cost too much, but the simple fact of the matter is that we have done this. Mm-hmm. So, okay, we've done this. Can other places do it too? Europe seems to be ahead of us in a lot of ways, although I think when you see a country like Germany saying that they're going to get all their power from wind turbines, and then they build all the wind turbines and it doesn't produce enough power, now they're under the gun to satisfy their electrical needs. That kind of all or nothing thinking is, I think, destructive. And, this came up recently with the Ford Motor Company, who they were building electric F-150 pickup trucks, and they cut their production in half on them. Why? People don't want them. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just that simple. Right. If people wanted them, they would have doubled their production on them, but people don't want them. That's not to say it's not cool technology. I think it is. It's not to say that people won't want them in short order. I think they might, but they don't want them right now. So, you look around the world and you see Western countries really digging in deep on this sort of thing. I don't know that we can get to the moral high ground to the point where we can tell poor countries that they have to behave as we do. That just doesn't seem right.
I don't think we can get to the moral high ground there, but what we can do is help them out with new technologies. Nobody helped us out with new technologies because they didn't exist.
Yeah. And this gets to be the point, right? When you think about something like degrowth, why is it that we all have to go backwards? Why can't we all go forwards?
And that's the thing that maddens me so much, because growth isn't the problem, it's the answer. That's how you solve these problems.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think all the way down the line. I don't think there's even the hint of an incorrect second in that line of thought.
Unless,
and yet
there is one unless, and that is unless your ultimate goal is to reduce the human population by 90%.
Well, that is their goal.
Yeah.
Right? The degrowth people are depopulation people. They're still working with boneheaded Malthusian economics that was wrong when Malthus spat it out, and it's been wrong ever since. And yet, if you polled a bunch of people, non-experts, 90% of them would say that overpopulation is a problem.
Yep.
They're all wrong.
That's right. Well, they've been saying it for 30 years.
30 years. I've been saying it for 300
Yeah,
years.
well, of course. Yeah.
It's been wrong the whole time. And it's baffling that people can't see the absolute correlation. And notice I said correlation. I think there's a strong case to be made for causation, but there's at least correlation with global population and global standard of living. They go up in lockstep.
What always strikes me as odd when I come to this conclusion, as we've done now, that the real goal is to, get rid of 90% of the human population. If we said that to those same people about any species other than Homo sapien, they'd blow a gasket. What do you mean eradicate 90% of this species? You're destroying the planet.
We must get rid of the whales.
Right. So somehow we're not part of the environment, or we're not to be protected or respected to the extent that other pieces are.
Well, I mean, ultimately, we manipulate the environment more than any other species, therefore we're evil.
Do we? I don't know. Maybe.
Oh, yes, we do. When monkeys build factories, get back to me. Of course we do.
I don't know. I'm thinking of ants. Ants, principally.
When ants can despoil a continent, get back to me.
Bacteria.
Bacteria may get the best of us before long, but that will be quite different. They'll get the best of us, not the environment. I don't know. When I think about degrowth, what I see are silly people trying to address serious problems. And I would far rather see serious people trying to address serious problems. And we're just not getting it.
Or even if you're going to be an unserious person, at least be honest about what you're doing. What your goals are, be honest about the facts also.
And as usual, I'm going to advise people to ignore the Europeans on these matters, because that's the home of unserious people. They're going to cause all kinds of serious problems, but that is the home of unserious people.
Yeah, for Europeans to call for direct democracy strikes me as strange. That's not something they have a great track record with, by and large.
I don't even know what to say about that. Direct democracy is silly no matter where you find it. And people who want it are very silly people.
Should we put a coda on here as to what direct democracy means?
No, I'm all done with that. I'm all done with it. I'm too irritated for that.
This is your field. Don't you want to talk about it?
I do not. On that happy note, we're done here.
Direct democracy means people voting
week.
Directly for or against the laws, not electing representatives.
Yeah. Enough. I don't want to talk about it. Stop it.
I was talking about
Stop it. Ant, I'll see you.
See you next week, James.
And hey, be nice to each other. And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.